The rent collector came on the first Tuesday of November, his knock sharp and insistent against the warped planks of the door. Eliza Brennan counted the coins into his palm with deliberate slowness, her daughter Violet watching from the corner where the ceiling sloped so low a grown woman could not stand upright. The room they rented held a rough-hewn table scarred with knife marks, 2 apple crates for sitting, a straw tick they all 3 shared that smelled perpetually of mildew, and little else. The walls wept moisture when the temperature dropped, leaving dark trails that froze into delicate patterns when the coldest nights arrived. Her son Aaron, 5 years old and small for his age, sat on the floor mending a torn sack with a curved needle, his concentration absolute, his small fingers working the stitches with precision beyond his years. When the collector departed, Eliza opened the leather pouch her late husband's brother had sent from the Eastern Territories. Inside lay $47 in mixed coin and a folded deed describing 17 acres in the highlands above the town of Ashford Reach, a small settlement pressed against the wilderness. The accompanying letter described the land as cave country, broken terrain, worthless for tillage, avoided by sensible men. Her husband's brother wrote that he had won the deed in a card game and had no use for such remote property. Eliza read the letter twice by candlelight, while Violet braided rope from dried grass and Aaron sorted their meager beans, discarding those showing weevil damage. The next morning, she told them they would leave before heavy snowfall became impassable, that they would take what they could carry and make something of the worthless land. Violet, 10 years old with her father's steady hands, asked only what they would need to carry. Aaron gathered his few possessions into a bundle without being asked. Over 3 days, Eliza sold what furniture they possessed, purchased 2 woolen blankets, a crosscut saw, an adze, a small iron stove in 4 pieces, 20 pounds of seed potatoes, dried peas, cornmeal, salt pork, tallow candles, hemp rope, 3 tin plates, and a laying hen in a wicker cage. She kept her husband's tools and the leather satchel that held his surveying instruments. They left Ashford Reach on foot in early morning, their possessions divided across their backs and loaded onto a borrowed handcart. The townspeople watched from doorways without offering help, their faces showing pity and satisfaction. The trail climbed steadily through stands of pine and naked birch, the ground already hard with early frost that crunched beneath their boots and the handcart's wheels. Violet pulled the cart over exposed roots and scattered stones without complaint, her breath coming harder on the steeper sections, but her pace never faltering, her knuckles white where she gripped the worn wooden handles. Aaron walked beside his mother, his breath puffing white in the increasingly cold air, his small hand gripping the hem of her shawl when the path grew steep or when loose rocks threatened to turn beneath his feet. They stopped twice each day to rest and eat, sitting on fallen logs or flat stones while Eliza distributed portions of cornbread she had baked before their departure and strips of the salt pork. The hen pecked at crumbs through the bars of her cage and made soft clucking sounds that seemed almost conversational. On the second day, they reached the cave country, a tumbled and broken landscape of granite outcrops that rose like the bones of the earth itself, frozen springs that hung in curtains of ice, and twisted trees that had fought the wind for decades and bore the scars of their struggle in gnarled trunks and asymmetrical crowns. The temperature here felt several degrees colder than in the lowlands, and the wind carried the mineral smell of deep earth and ancient stone. The cave itself opened in the side of a ridge, a mouth wide enough to admit a wagon with room to spare, its entrance framed by 2 massive boulders that leaned together like conspirators. The interior extended back into darkness that swallowed the light of their single candle, the flame guttering in a breeze that seemed to come from within rather than without. Eliza stood at the threshold with her hand raised to shield the candle, feeling the subtle movement of air against her palm, and realized with growing excitement that it was warm air, a gentle exhalation that defied the November cold settling over the highlands. She sent Violet to gather kindling and small branches from the pine trees that grew near the cave entrance, while she herself explored the cave's dimensions, pacing off the space with careful measured steps. Her husband's measuring tape stretched between her hands and the walls, noting each distance in his surveying notebook with a stub of pencil. The main chamber extended 40 feet from the entrance to the back wall and measured 20 feet across at its widest point, with the ceiling vaulted high enough that a tall man could walk upright anywhere within without fear of striking his head on the stone overhead. The walls were dry to the touch, showing none of the seeping moisture that plagued so many natural caves, and the floor consisted of packed earth mixed with fine sand that gave slightly beneath her weight, but seemed stable and well drained. At the rear of the chamber, partially concealed by a fold in the rock wall, she discovered the source of the warm air, a fissure perhaps 6 inches wide that descended into darkness beyond the reach of her candle's light, breathing warm air steadily upward in a phenomenon she knew must be some kind of thermal vent connecting to heated chambers deep below. The warmth was gentle but persistent, and when she held her hand above the fissure, she could feel heat rising in waves that reminded her of the air above a cookstove. This was why snow did not drift into the entrance, even when the drifts outside grew deep. Why the cave's interior temperature remained tolerable, even as winter's teeth closed over the land beyond. She marked the boundaries of her plan in the dirt floor with a pointed stick, while Aaron collected smooth stones from the cave floor, testing each one by weight and texture before adding it to his growing collection, stacking them in careful towers that he built and rebuilt with patient concentration. That night, they slept inside for the first time, wrapped in their blankets near the thermal vent, and Eliza lay awake for hours, listening to her children's breathing and the wind outside, and planning the work that would begin with sunrise. She dreamed of walls rising inside the cave, of windows that would let in light but keep out cold, of a garden that would grow in impossible warmth, fed by the earth's own heat. She felled the first tree on their 4th day in the cave country, a straight pine 60 feet tall with bark the color of rust and a trunk diameter she estimated at 18 inches. A tree she brought down with the crosscut saw in a process that demanded rhythm and patience and trust between 2 people working in concert. Violet pulled the opposite handle in perfect rhythm with her mother's strokes, the blade biting through the pale wood with each pass, sawdust accumulating in fragrant piles at their feet, the tree's weight shifting subtly as the cut deepened until Eliza called the warning, and they stepped back as the pine tilted, hung suspended for a breathless moment, then fell with a crash that sent snow cascading from nearby branches and startled a pair of ravens into raucous flight. They limbed it together using a hatchet and the adze, working from the base toward the crown, removing each branch flush with the trunk, then measured and cut the trunk into 12-foot lengths that they could manage, marking each piece with the hatchet to preserve their sequence. Dragging the sections back to the cave required the rope and an understanding of leverage and friction that her husband had taught her years before on the farm they'd lost to debt and drought. They tied the rope around one end of each log, ran it over a smoothly barked birch limb they positioned as a pulley point, and used their combined weight to slide the heavy timber over the frozen ground, sometimes managing 50 feet in an hour, sometimes less when the terrain resisted. Aaron gathered pine branches for kindling, sorting them into bundles according to thickness, the thinnest for starting fires, the medium for sustaining heat, the thickest for overnight burns in the stove. The work took 6 full days from dawn to dusk, their hands raw despite the gloves Eliza had brought, their shoulders and backs aching each night as they lay near the thermal vent. They cut 12 more trees over the following 2 weeks, selecting each one for straightness and lack of rot, examining the bark for signs of disease or insect damage, choosing specimens that had grown in good soil with adequate sunlight. By the end of the 2nd week, they had accumulated a stack of logs beside the cave entrance, bark still attached, surfaces weeping sap that froze in golden beads and had to be chipped away before they could work the wood. Eliza began the cabin framework inside the cave's mouth, 6 feet back from the entrance to allow for air circulation and to position the structure in a zone where the cave's warmth met the outside cold. She dug holes for corner posts with the pickaxe she had borrowed from a reluctant tool merchant in Ashford Reach, chipping through the packed earth and reaching down to more solid ground beneath, measuring each hole's depth with a marked stick to ensure level corners. The posts went in first, 8-inch diameter logs stripped of bark and cut to identical 8-foot lengths, set into the holes and secured with smaller rocks wedged tight and packed earth tamped down with the flat end of the adze. She cut notches with careful precision, creating interlocking joints that would hold the horizontal logs in place, without need for nails they could not afford. Each notch shaped to match the curve of the log above and below. Her hands blistered, and the blisters opened, and then calloused over in layers that marked her progress. Violet held each log steady while her mother worked, learning to anticipate the angle of the adze and the force of each swing. They raised the walls 1 course at a time, rolling the logs up temporary ramps made from smaller poles, fitting them into the notches, testing the level with a tool that had belonged to Eliza's husband. They chinked the gaps between logs with moss they gathered from the shaded north faces of rocks outside, mixing it with clay, dug from the stream bank, and water carried in their wooden bucket, pressing the mixture deep into every crack where cold air might penetrate. Aaron made hundreds of trips to the clay bank, his bucket growing heavier as he learned to fill it more efficiently, his small boots developing a path through the snow that grew deeper each week. The cabin took shape with agonizing slowness, a structure 16 feet square with walls that rose course by course to 7 feet at the lowest point, 8 at the corners. She framed a simple gable roof using smaller poles, notched and fitted, covered them with split shingles she carved from cedar rounds using a froe and mallet, overlapping each row to shed water, securing them with wooden pegs she whittled during the evenings. A door came next, constructed from planks she split from a single large log, fitted together with wooden dowels and reinforced with diagonal braces, hung on hinges made from leather straps cut from an old belt and secured with hand-forged nails she bought at great expense. 2 window frames followed, rough rectangles cut through the walls at strategic positions to admit maximum light, each covered with cloth she had oiled with rendered fat to make it translucent and weather-resistant. Inside, she assembled the iron stove from its 4 pieces, connecting them with bolts and ensuring each joint sealed tightly, then fitted the stovepipe carefully into a hole she had chiseled through the cabin ceiling and up through the natural chimney of rock above, using clay to seal the gaps and prevent sparks from escaping into the dry wood. The work consumed the entirety of November and half of December, and when it was finished, they had a dwelling that stood inside the cave like a ship in a bottle. 4 solid walls and a roof that shed the moisture that occasionally condensed on the cave ceiling above, warm and dry and separate from the brutal cold that now gripped the highlands with temperatures that dropped far below freezing each night. Eliza divided the cave floor according to the vision that had come to her during that first night's sleep, a plan that had crystallized in her mind with surprising clarity and completeness. The thermal vent warmed the entire chamber to a temperature that hovered consistently near 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the world outside froze solid, a temperature she verified with the mercury thermometer she had packed among their essential supplies. She built raised beds from split logs, constructing frames that stood 8 inches high and would contain the soil she planned to import, each bed carefully positioned to receive optimal exposure to the lantern light they would use to supplement the weak winter sun that barely penetrated the cave entrance. The beds ran along the cave's western wall, 6 rectangular frames in total, each measuring 4 feet in width and 12 feet in length, built with corners that fit together using the same notching technique she had employed on the cabin walls. She and Violet carried earth up from the lowlands in woven baskets, making trip after trip down the trail to a place where a stream had deposited rich alluvial soil in a wide flat area, filling their baskets with the dark, loamy earth and hauling it back up slope, each load representing perhaps 40 pounds of soil that had to be transported nearly half a mile over difficult terrain. They mixed this imported soil with composted pine needles they gathered from beneath the trees near the cave, material that had decomposed into a crumbly brown substance that would improve drainage and provide nutrients. Later, when they had animals, they would add manure to further enrich the beds. The work of filling all 6 beds required 2 weeks of labor, their backs aching from the constant bending and lifting, their hands permanently stained brown from the soil. She planted the seed potatoes in 3 of the beds, cutting each potato into pieces that contained at least 2 eyes, allowing the cut surfaces to dry for a day, before placing them 6 inches deep in the soil, covering them with a layer of straw to insulate against temperature fluctuations and retain moisture. The remaining 3 beds she reserved for spring greens and root vegetables she would plant later. On the eastern side of the cave, she constructed a pen from split rails, creating a rectangular enclosure that measured roughly 10 feet by 15 feet, large enough to comfortably house several sheep without crowding. She floored it with straw she had purchased in town, building up a thick layer that would provide cushioning and absorb waste, and installed a manger built from scrap wood and a water trough she carved from a hollow log, using the adze and a curved knife, working the interior smooth so no splinters would injure the animals' mouths. The trough required 3 full days of carving and sanding, but when finished, it held water without leaking and had a lip height that would accommodate both adult sheep and lambs. In town, at the livestock market held each Saturday, she traded 2 silver dollars for 3 ewes, young animals with good fleece and strong legs, animals the seller assured her were healthy and proven breeders. She led them up the trail on rope halters she had braided herself from hemp, walking slowly to accommodate their pace, while Violet carried Aaron on her back for the steepest sections where his short legs would have struggled. The sheep settled into their pen as if they had always lived there, unbothered by the stone ceiling above or the cabin that shared their space or the unusual situation of living indoors. They grazed contentedly on hay Eliza, purchased from a farmer in the lowlands, dried timothy and clover that still smelled sweet, despite the winter storage. Within days they were thriving in the cave's steady warmth, their wool growing thick and soft, their eyes bright and alert. Aaron appointed himself their shepherd without being asked, checking their water trough twice daily and refilling it from buckets he carried from the spring, scratching their woolly heads and speaking to them in soft tones, learning to recognize each one by subtle differences in their markings and the sounds they made. Violet tended the garden beds with equal dedication, watching for the first green shoots of potato plants with an anticipation that bordered on obsession, watering the soil when it felt dry, adjusting the lanterns to provide what she believed was optimal light. Eliza worked on refinements to their living space, shelves constructed from leftover planks and mounted to the cabin walls to hold their provisions, organizing their supplies of cornmeal and salt pork and dried beans in a system that made sense, and allowed her to track their consumption and plan for resupply. She built a proper table from planks she had split and planed smooth, a surface large enough for all three of them to sit around for meals, and three-legged stools that would sit level even on the slightly uneven cabin floor. She carved wooden pegs from birch branches and drove them into the cabin walls at strategic heights for hanging tools and garments and the coils of rope they seemed to accumulate. She rendered tallow from the fat she had saved from their salt pork, melting it slowly over the stove and pouring it into molds she made from rolled bark, creating candles that burned cleaner and longer than the cheap ones they had brought from town. She built a small loom from birch saplings, notching and tying them into a frame that would allow her to weave simple cloth, and began teaching Violet the patterns and techniques, how to maintain tension, and how to pass the shuttle, skills that would serve the girl throughout her life. The cave became a world unto itself, insulated from the winter that howled outside, lit by lantern light and the warm glow of the stove, warmed by the earth's own breath rising from the fissure, filled with the gentle sounds of sheep rustling in their straw and water dripping somewhere in the deeper recesses and the click of Violet's shuttle on the loom. When Eliza went to town for supplies in late December, leading one sheep to sell for cash, the townspeople gathered to watch her pass. They knew about the cave land now, knew she'd built a cabin inside stone and was attempting to farm in winter. The blacksmith called it madness, said the cave would collapse and crush them all. The preacher's wife said it was unnatural, that warmth in winter was the devil's work. The merchant who sold her cornmeal and salt asked if she'd lost her mind, spending inheritance money on worthless rock. Eliza listened without responding, paid for her goods, and walked back up the trail with her purchases in a pack. Violet asked why the townspeople spoke cruel words. Eliza said that people feared what they did not understand, and that fear made them mean. She told Violet they would prove the worth of their work, not with arguments, but with results. Aaron asked if the cave would fall down. Eliza showed him the vaulted ceiling, explained how the arch distributed weight, how stone that had stood for thousands of years would not fail now. That night, she added a second window to the cabin, wanting more light, and she reinforced the garden beds with cross braces. She inspected the sheep and found them fat and healthy, their wool growing thick. The potato plants had sprouted, pale green shoots reaching toward the lantern light. She planted seeds for kale and turnips in the remaining beds, watered them from buckets, and covered the soil with straw to hold moisture. Violet helped her build a drying rack for herbs and vegetables, and Aaron learned to card wool using a pair of brushes Eliza fashioned from wood and bent nails. The work continued without pause, each task leading to the next, and the cave filled with the smells of earth and animals and cooking food. January brought cold so severe that the trees in the forest split with sounds like gunfire. The snow accumulated in drifts that buried the cave entrance to a depth of 4 feet, and Eliza dug a tunnel through it each morning to maintain access to the outside world. Inside the cave, the temperature never dropped below 45 degrees. The sheep grew rounder, the garden beds flourished, and the cabin stayed warm enough that they slept without their heavy coats. Eliza refined her systems daily, adjusting the stove's draft to maximize heat, while minimizing wood consumption, repositioning the lanterns to give the plants optimal light, rotating the sheep's bedding to keep it dry. She taught Violet to milk the ewes, though they were not yet ready, and to recognize the signs of illness or distress in animals. She taught Aaron to identify edible plants from the drawings in a book her husband had owned, and he practiced writing their names on a slate with a piece of chalk. They fell into rhythms that matched the cave's steady breathing, waking with the thermal vent's warmth, working through the short winter days, sleeping to the sound of wind outside and sheep rustling in their pen. Eliza began shearing the sheep in early February, using hand shears to remove their thick wool, and she and Violet washed it in heated water and spread it to dry on racks. The wool was fine and plentiful, enough to trade for goods they could not produce themselves. Aaron helped card it into soft clouds, his small fingers quick and careful. Eliza planned a second trading trip to town for March, when the roads would be passable again. She made a list of what they needed: more seed, nails, a second milk pail, sugar, coffee, needles for sewing. She calculated what the wool would bring and what the first vegetables would earn. The numbers suggested they could survive, perhaps even prosper, if the cave continued to provide its impossible warmth and if their labor continued to yield results. The storm arrived on the first Monday of March, a blizzard that turned the sky white and dropped the temperature to depths Eliza had not experienced in her lifetime. Outside the cave, the world became unrecognizable, trees vanishing under snow, trails erased, the sun itself obscured behind clouds that seemed made of iron. Inside, they were safe. But Eliza worried about the townspeople below, many of whom lived in structures no better than the one she'd abandoned, with walls that leaked heat and stoves that consumed wood faster than it could be gathered. She thought of families huddled in single rooms, burning furniture to stay alive, rationing food that would not last until spring. Violet asked if the people who had mocked them were suffering now. Eliza said they almost certainly were, and that suffering deserved compassion regardless of who experienced it. She made a decision then, standing in the warm cave with her children and her thriving garden and her healthy sheep. She would take food to town when the storm broke, would share what they had grown in their impossible cave with people who had called her foolish. Violet said the townspeople did not deserve help. Eliza said that help was not about deserving, it was about being able to give it. Aaron said nothing, but he began sorting vegetables from the garden beds, selecting the largest turnips and the healthiest kale. The storm lasted 4 days. When it ended, the snow had piled so high that Eliza had to dig for 2 hours to create an exit tunnel. She loaded a sled with vegetables, smoked mutton from a sheep she'd slaughtered in February, and a sack of wool. Violet and Aaron helped her pull it down the trail, the runners hissing over the packed snow, their breath clouding white in the brilliant, cold sunlight. Ashford Reach looked like a village under siege. Smoke rose from only half the chimneys, and the streets were empty except for a few men hauling firewood on sleds. Eliza went first to the preacher's house, where she knew 3 families had crowded together for warmth. She knocked, and when the preacher's wife opened the door, Eliza saw a room full of pale faces and heard children coughing. She offered the sled's contents without preamble, said she had more if they needed it. The preacher's wife stared at the vegetables as if they were a vision, her eyes filling with tears. She asked how such things could exist in March, in the grip of winter. Eliza said they had a warm place and good soil, and that they had been fortunate. The preacher himself came to the door, the man who had called the cave unnatural, and he thanked her with a voice that shook. Eliza moved through the town, distributing food to families she knew were struggling, accepting nothing in return except stammered gratitude. The blacksmith who had predicted the cave's collapse offered to repair her tools for free. The merchant gave her a bag of coffee and refused payment. By the time she returned to the cave that evening, pulling the empty sled with Violet and Aaron beside her, the sun was setting and the temperature was dropping again. But something had shifted in the air. The townspeople had seen the proof of her work. had tasted vegetables grown in winter warmth, had felt the quality of wool sheared in February. They knew now that the cave was not madness, but ingenuity, that the mother and her children had built something worth building. Violet asked if the people would be kind now. Eliza said she hoped so, but that it did not matter, because they had acted rightly regardless. The rest of March passed in steady work. The snow began to recede, revealing the bones of the forest, and the days grew longer. Eliza planted more seeds in the garden beds, rotating crops to keep the soil healthy. The sheep lambed in early April, two healthy offspring that Aaron named and doted on with fierce dedication. Violet learned to spin wool on a drop spindle Eliza carved from birch, and she produced yarn fine enough for knitting. They made plans for the spring, expanding the garden beds, building a proper barn structure outside the cave for warmer months, purchasing more sheep, perhaps a milk cow if they could afford it. Eliza taught Violet to read her father's surveying instruments, showed her how to measure angles and calculate distances, skills that might prove useful. She taught Aaron his numbers and letters, using the chalk and slate, and he learned with the same quiet concentration he brought to every task. The cave remained their center, warm and secure, proof that innovation and labor could overcome circumstance. Eliza had no interest in boasting, or in making the townspeople feel small for their earlier mockery. She had proven what needed proving, and that was enough. When visitors came from Ashford Reach in late April, drawn by stories of the cave farm, she welcomed them and showed them the thermal vent, explained the principles of heat retention and the advantages of stone walls. She shared seeds and offered advice. Some of the visitors left humbled, others inspired. Eliza treated all with the same patient courtesy, the same willingness to help. By May, the highlands had transformed into a landscape of green grass and wildflowers. The garden beds produced abundantly, and Eliza began preserving vegetables in clay jars, storing them on shelves in the cabin. The sheep grazed outside during the day and returned to their pen at night. Violet had grown taller, her hands as capable as her mother's now, and she worked with the confidence of someone who had built something real. Aaron tended the lambs and learned to recognize the plants that could be eaten and those that could not. The cave had given them more than shelter. It had given them a foundation, a place from which they could build a life according to their own design. Eliza sat outside the cave entrance one evening in late May, watching the sun set over the ridges, Violet beside her mending a sock and Aaron asleep with his head in her lap. She thought of her husband, wished he could see what they had made from worthless land and an inheritance most would have squandered. She thought of the winter that had tested them and the townspeople they had helped despite mockery. She felt no pride, only a quiet satisfaction that came from work completed and principles upheld. The cave breathed its warm air into the cool spring night, and inside, the garden beds waited for the next planting. The sheep rustled in their pen. The stove ticked as it cooled. Everything was in its place. Everything was as it should be. And Eliza Brennan, with her children beside her and the land stretching wide and wild before them, knew they would endure whatever came next because they had learned to build warmth in the coldest season and to share it freely when others needed it most.